Welcome everybody to our program tonight. I'm Elizabeth Tatum. I'm the director of Historic Red Hook, and this is the beginning of our fall speaker series. It's the first program of 5 this fall, sponsored by or funded by the county to do this, which is very exciting. So I would like to first just thank all of the board members and volunteers who made this event possible today. If you're a board member, please raise your hand. Thank you all. And Diane in the back, yes. The sound is good?
We can hear you, but barely.
Barely?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll turn up the volume a bit. Thank you. We're just gonna keep doing a couple of finessing with sound here. So if you're a volunteer who helped out today, they're all in the other room eating all the cookies. I'm just kidding. They really pulled this all together, which I really appreciate. So I will be introducing our speaker, but I first just wanted to go over the other programs in this series. So we have 4 more programs. The speakers are listed on the left there. On October 4th, we have Dylan Streifenator speaking about Red Hook, Rhinebeck, and the Revolution. That's going to be your ultra-local history about the people who served and fought during the war. On the 18th, we have Hadrian Coumans and Joe Baker on Lenape Perspectives on the American Revolution. They're coming up from the New York City from the Lenape Center to talk about that. And then on November 22nd, we have Kirsten E. Wood, who is talking about her book, Accommodating the Republic, How Taverns Encouraged Travel, Innovations, and Civic Engagement in the New United States. I would highly recommend getting a copy of her book before then and diving into it. It's really wonderful. She's flying up from Florida for this program. She's an expert on taverns in the Northeast and has done some studies of the Hudson Valley as well. So that'll be a really great program. And then on September 20th, we have kind of a different format. This is an all-day hardscrabble day open house from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. So we are very lucky to have a foodways interpreter who will be here in the building dressed in 18th century women's clothes and cooking in the fireplace all day to show you how that was done. I can personally vouch for her. She's at the same PhD program that I'm going to right now in SUNY Albany. Her dissertation is on colonial kitchen spaces. So she's really a wonderful person to talk to, and we're very excited to have her here. And that'll be Hardscrabble Day. So there's going to be stuff happening in the village, and this building will be open all day. Our archives will be open all day. So there'll be a lot going on. We really hope you can make it. There's no registration required for that event. And we do have a Zoom ongoing that day, so you can watch from home the speaker at the fireplace as she talks to visitors all day. We have numerous other unrelated events. Well, we do have one more Rev War event happening at the Tavern Trail at the Lasting Joy Brewery. That's next week on September 12th, so you can register online. We then have our 5th annual cemetery crawl launching on Hardscrabble Day as well. It's going to be a busy day. So if you are a cemetery crawler and you want to join us for that, you can go to the village and get your scavenger hunt booklet, or you can just do it from home or just do it at your own time for the whole month of September through October. You can go through 6 different cemeteries and listen to over 100 biographies of the people buried in those cemeteries. On October 9th, we have our annual meeting here. So if you're a member and like to join us, it'll be a nice sit-down dinner in this room. So please, if you're a member, look forward to receiving an invite from us shortly. Then on October 11th, Hudson River Heritage, which is a wonderful organization, is hosting a preservation exposition here in the Elmendorf. They've got all sorts of craftsmen here for that day, and the building will be open for you to talk to our volunteers as well. So come out for that. On the 22nd, we have another historic tavern trail. This one is our Halloween one, which is always fun. That's at Foster's Coach House in Rhinebeck. We'll be wrapping up the Cemetery Crawl Award ceremony on the 27th of October here. There'll be great prizes, so please come on out. And then in November, we're launching our online benefit auction, which is our biggest fundraiser of the year. So we always get a lot of really fun experiences, including tours of private homes and historic sites and memberships to historic sites. So please check that out. So I'm sorry about that. I've got a lot of Zoom notifications up here. But what I just wanted to plug is that we are almost all volunteer organization with the exception of me being part-time. We run with 10 volunteer trustees and then 260 members. And this free programming is made possible by people who make donations to the programs, who volunteer their time to help at programs or create programs, and also by becoming a member. So if you're interested in any of that, you can go to our website. I've got the URLs there, historicredhook.org/donate, volunteer, or become a member. So I'm going to be passing this over to BJ Lillis. BJ is an early American historian whose research brings together histories of Atlantic slavery, Indigenous North America, and English, Dutch, and German colonialism to explore the contested relationship between land, labor, and property in the Hudson Valley. BJ is currently a research associate at the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture in Williamsburg, Virginia. They completed their PhD in history at Princeton University in 2024. Before graduate school, BJ worked in public history at the Museum of the City of New York, including as a project assistant for New York at its core, the museum's groundbreaking permanent exhibition on the past, present, and future of New York City. They're also known for their acclaimed collaborations with the artists Lisa Riviera, Beautiful Boy, and The Silence of Spaces, exploring the history and performance of gender. So I'm very excited to pass this over to BJ.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to have a drink of water. Just getting started. Don't worry, we have all afternoon. I've been told anyway. Hi, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here. This is an incredible building. I have never been here before. I walked in and I was like, wow, this is cool. I'm so excited. I want to thank Historic Red Hook, Elizabeth, Dutchess County, which I believe provided some important support. And of course, all of you for coming out. There'd really be no point in me giving a talk if no one came. So today I'm going to be talking, as my title suggests, about Indigenous land and colonial property and the way these two things depended on each other in the Hudson Valley in the colonial period. I'm going to talk about how Indigenous landscapes became incorporated, quite literally written into the records of colonial property. And I'm going to argue that a particular kind of property, the colonial manor, about which you're going to learn more tonight than you ever wanted to know, is key to understanding how colonists and Indigenous people sort of related to the land and how their relationships to the land shaped their relationships with each other. And that was true not just on the big manors that you all may have heard of, like Livingston Manor and West River Manor, but also on a lot of smaller estates that were developed along manorial lines, as I'll talk about. I'm going to start in the 1680s, when New York's first large manors were established. I'm going to talk a little bit about what a manor was and how they began and why they're here. And then I'm going to talk about how two particular Indigenous nations, the Mohicans and Wappingers, both shaped and resisted the development of really a manorial society in the Hudson Valley. And then I'm going to end in the 1760s with the most fun part of the presentation, when some landlords started to take a kind of different attitude towards what it meant to have a manor, what it meant to be a landlord in the Hudson Valley. And how they were going to manage what they were increasingly thinking of their land in a very possessive way. Tenant farmers and Indigenous communities protested changes in the landlord-tenant relationship. And those changes were part of a larger turn, a larger change towards a more commercial, a more capitalist, really, kind of agriculture that was happening across the British Empire in the 1760s. So when tenant farmers in the colonial Hudson Valley did things like organize rent strikes, march, break jails, hold mock trials, openly rebel against government authority, they were really participating in what I see as a larger movement that was happening, not in an organized way, but in a kind of spontaneous way all over the Atlantic world. At the same time, the Mohicans and Wappingers took their fight for their land into the colonial legal system, working to defend their rights within the empire and traveling to London to do so. But before I get to those stories, I want to take a moment and situate us a little bit in time and space. So when I give this talk outside of New York, or talk about my work in general outside of the Hudson Valley, this is so important because no one knows where anything is, and really people don't know very much about the Hudson Valley. In fact, it's maybe less important in Red Hook. But the truth is that historians of colonial America have sort of neglected the Hudson Valley. And one of the core arguments of my research is really just simply that the Hudson Valley is important, that it's distinctive, and that within the British Empire, within this kind of larger context, it has a lot to teach us about colonial development, about colonialism. And so I want to begin by talking in the largest sense about what made the colonial Hudson Valley so unique and about who lived there. So as many of you probably know in this room, the Hudson River below Albany isn't really quite a river at all, right? It's a tidal estuary. Maybe you could call it like a fjord. What this means basically is that the tide runs all the way to Albany, right? Sometimes the river flows north, sometimes the river flows south, sometimes the river flows north and south at the same time because the heavier water is going one direction and the other water is floating on top of it, which I still can't quite wrap my head around. What this means in practice, right, is that ocean-going vessels all the way back in the colonial period could sail to Albany with the tide and get back. And that means, right, in a sense, that the Hudson River becomes kind of like a long branch of the Atlantic Ocean. So I love this map, which is from the 1750s, because it really shows how Europeans conceptualized northeastern North America as a world of rivers, right? You can see the Susquehanna River over here, the Delaware River, the Hudson River, the Connecticut River, the St. Lawrence River, everything's kind of closer together than it should be. So European colonists almost always built a fort and eventually a town at the furthest point that they could navigate on a river like this, the fall line, they called it. And those places have tended to become state capitals, right? So Trenton is on the Delaware River and it's like down here somewhere. And Hartford is on the Connecticut River and it's like down here somewhere, right? Then Albany's on the Hudson River and it's like way up here. And so that difference is actually really important in the colonial period. So I'm going to move fast now because we have a lot to get through. But in the early 17th century, right, the Dutch, who are having their golden age in Europe at this moment, established a trading colony in North America called New Netherland, and they center it on the Hudson River. Richest country in Northern Europe, best river in North America. Is it a coincidence? Who knows? So basically, the English conquer New Netherland in 1664. They lose it in 1673. They get it back in 1674. So by the 1680s, which is when my work kind of really picks up, the Hudson Valley is a newly conquered Dutch colony. It's under English governance, and it's located in this really sort of geographically unique and strategically important part of North America. And in part because of this history, the Hudson Valley is, as some of you might know, really incredibly diverse. There's no sort of majority population, right? The settler population is Dutch, German, Scandinavian, French, English, Irish, Scottish, New English, which is really not the same as English. There's no clear majority, and Dutch and English sort of compete to be the lingua franca, depending on where you are and when you are. And there's also a substantial enslaved population, which also might be speaking English or Dutch or German or all three languages or other languages, including African languages. The indigenous Hudson Valley was also incredibly diverse. In what's now Western New York, you have the Haudenosaunee, also known as the Six Nations or the Iroquois. They're like over here, basically. They're incredibly powerful in the 17th and 18th centuries, right? Maybe in part because of this sort of strategic position they occupy at the confluence of all of these waterways. South and east of the Haudenosaunee, the Mohicans live on both sides of the Hudson River around Albany. And then south of them, you have the Wappingers more or less on the east side of the river, and the Esopus and other Munsee nations more or less on the west side of the river. Although I've slowly come to understand that maybe the Hudson River isn't quite the border that we've all been saying it is for Indigenous people. So in short, this is a very, very diverse place, right? Once you take in all these different levels of diversity, and the reason I really like to stress this pretty much every time I talk about the Hudson Valley is because my talk this afternoon is about the relationship between colonists and native people. But it's important to kind of keep in the back of our minds whenever we talk about the relationship between colonists and native people, that both of these categories are like incredibly expansive, right? We can't really assume very much about a person or about their life just from knowing that they're a colonist or knowing that they're a native person. We don't know what language we speak. They don't really know what culture they have. But that doesn't tell us very much. So my book manuscript is called A Valley Between Worlds. And in the largest sense, my work's about how the Hudson Valley becomes a sort of key connection point between continental North American world that's still dominated by indigenous power in the 17th and 18th centuries, and an imperial Atlantic world of competing empires. Caught between this world in the Hudson Valley in the colonial period, colonial landscapes were layered over, understood, and defined in a way that I'll show in a really concrete way, I hope, by indigenous land and landscapes. And as I've suggested, this layering was facilitated by the manor, which is a legal and economic institution that Europeans used to claim and settle land, to establish and negotiate property claims, and to organize agricultural production. So you may have some associations with the word manor, right? I think most people associate manors with medieval Europe, with like serfs and lords. And I think it's worth noting that colonial Americans also had some of those associations, which actually really didn't help the landlords' PR problems. You might also think about a manor house when you hear the word manor, right? The grand residence at the center of a manor or plantation or estate. And it's true that every manor had at least one manor house, like this one on Van Cortlandt Manor, or this one on Phillipsburg Manor. And I love this picture because you can see some of the other infrastructure, right, of the colonial manor. The mill dam and the mill, the barn, there would probably have been other storage buildings. There would actually have been slave quarters on this site. And all of these buildings were in fact built and operated by enslaved people. But a manor isn't really a house. There's a house on a manor, but what the manor really is a kind of property. And in the Hudson Valley, this kind of property is a defining feature of rural societies. Manors weren't unique to New York. They were common in Europe, of course. They were very common in England. They were part of colonial projects in Ireland and Maryland. But outside of New York, historians have really neglected the manor as a colonial institution. And even in New York, we haven't really fully grappled with what these manors, large and small, meant to the people who lived on them. And in part, this is because historians mostly haven't taken the time to ask what a manor was. They sort of assumed that manors were self-evident, that they understood them, and kind of left it at that. I also didn't set out to try and write about or understand manors. Frankly, it sounds like an incredibly boring topic to me, and I had no interest whatsoever. I was interested in the people. I was interested in the diversity I was telling you about and how people related to each other. But the more time I spent in the archives of the Hudson Valley, the more I came to think that I really needed to understand the manor and to believe that understanding the manor as an institution, these boring things about property and rent that you're going to be hearing about tonight, could really illuminate the relationships between settlers, indigenous people, and enslaved people. So what was a manor? Do I have a slide for this? No, well, eventually. On the most basic level, a manor is a legal form of property that joins a property right, a kind of land ownership, right, with a limited legal jurisdiction and grants both of them to an individual, a manor lord. The borders of New York's manors were thus important jurisdictional boundaries, right, akin to the borders of a township or a precinct, and manorial leaseholders had the right to elect local officials. And some of these manors were very large, right? The largest, Rensselaer Manor, which is here in pink, but also includes all of this below it, which is not in pink, is huge. I mean, it's very large, right? Livingston Manor is here, again, very large. And Cortlandt Manor down here, also in pink, very large. Let's see. So I love to show this map, which is from the 1770s, because the map maker who drew this put in incredible detail everywhere that settlers actually were. And so you can see, in fact, setting aside New England, which isn't part of the map, where settlers were in colonial New York, right? And in the places that settlers actually lived in the colonial period, the manors took up massive amounts of territory and often the best agricultural land. So today we mostly think of property as an absolute right, right? Your property belongs to you. What could be more simple? But in the colonial period, most Europeans didn't really think about property in this way. They understood that all land ultimately belonged to the king, and that land ownership, right, is a set of rights that are granted by the king to a subject, and that subject might in turn grant those rights to another subject, and that other subject, on some level, is a little bit subordinate to him in the same way that he's subordinate to the king, right? It's a hierarchical society, and land ownership fits into this hierarchical society. And this is how manorial property works. On manors, land ownership isn't absolute. The underlying value of the land is shared between the landlords and the tenant farmers who receive the land from those landlords. And actually, what I argue is that this kind of land ownership, this kind of sort of complicated shared land ownership, is what really defined a manor for colonial Americans. So whether or not you were one of these huge manors like Livingston Manor that showed up on a map in a big way, if a family owned a large estate that they leased to tenant farmers who had a sort of real long-term stake in their land, colonial Americans thought of that as a manor. And now I'm going to give a very local example, which I added yesterday and means that my talk is probably going to go over a little. Take Rhinebeck, right? Certainly not part of a manor. You probably would have heard of it if it was, right? The land here was originally granted in 2 large land patents, which is what it was called, right? When the British Crown grants land to a subject. One to the Beekman and one to the Shire families. The word manor doesn't appear anywhere, right? In the early 18th century, those patents were divided between various Beekman and Shire heirs in very large chunks. But they mostly weren't sold off into individual plots. Instead, families like the Beekmans and the Rutsons, who also inherited a bunch of this land, rented the land to tenant farmers. So Henry Beekman Jr. May not have been a manor lord, but he sure acted like one. The Lord of all Rhinebeck, a group of disgruntled German missionaries called him in the 1740s. And he did, in fact, write in his rent book about tenants delivering wheat to his manor. He used the word. He was modeling the kind of relationship he had with his tenants on what he saw in a place like Livingston Manor. So what did a manor lease look like? On Rensselaer Manor, leases were perpetual. A perpetual lease is sort of half lease, half deed, right? So you and your heirs possess the land forever, but you have to pay rent. On other manors, leases were measured in lives. So that means that the lease lasts for very commonly 2 or 3 lives. A 3-life lease would be as long as you, your wife, and your eldest child live. When I lived in Brooklyn, my landlord could raise my rent whenever my lease came due at the end of the year. If my lease had been for 3 lives, my landlord would have had to have waited until my son died and my grandson inherited the land, right? I really think we should bring back this system. I think we should consider it. On other manors, like Phillipsburg Manor, for example, leases were technically annual, but both landlords and tenants agreed that landlords could neither refuse to renew a lease nor raise the rent kind of unilaterally, right? So again, to take a local example that's going to make my talk go over, this week, I found a lease from John Rutson and his wife, Catherine Beekman, for a farm on Landsman Creek, which is somewhere around here, I think. You probably know the geography better than me. For just 10 shillings on signing the lease, so basically no money, John Van Bradenberg got a document that looked a whole lot like a deed. The land would belong to him and his heirs forever, except he would pay 30 bushels of good merchantable winter wheat and 2 fat hens a year. He had to grind his grain at Henry Beekman's grist mill. And Rutson had first dibs on buying the entire crop. If he sold the lease, he had to offer it to sell it back to Rutson first. And he could only cut down as much wood as he needed for his own farm. He absolutely could not sell wood. So in other words, he kind of owned this farm, but he kind of didn't. In fact, the underlying value of the farm was effectively shared between the landlord and the tenant. As I noted, tenants usually needed the landlord's consent to sell the farm. And in fact, often those proceeds were shared. So usually the tenant would get 2/3 or 3/4 of the value of the farm on sale, and the landlord would get the other 1/3 or 1/4. And the rent farmers paid was not a market relationship. It was a customary relationship. It was a customary rent that was modeled on the traditional terms of manorial tenancy in England and the Netherlands. So most manor residents pay between 15 and 25 Dutch shekels of wheat per year, plus 4 fat hens, and it does usually say that the hens have to be fat, and 1 or 2 days of labor to their landlords. Not a market relationship, right? It's not going up and down based on supply and demand. It's the customary rent that everyone has to pay. The land on colonial New York's manors was also shared with Indigenous people. Indigenous communities absolutely didn't just up and leave when a manor was established, as way too many historians have assumed. They shared manorial land with tenants. On manors, land ownership, as I've kind of tried to explain, was itself continually negotiated. And it was entirely possible for a manor lord, a tenant farmer, and an Indigenous community to all consider themselves like the owners of the same exact piece of land, right? And legitimately so. So I want to take a moment now to try and make this as concrete as possible by looking at a legal document pretty closely, the manorial patent that established Livingston Manor, which is pretty close to where we are now. This patent was granted by the governor of New York, Thomas Dongan, to a Dutch-speaking Scottish merchant named Robert Livingston in 1686. And I apologize that these are rather boring copies. Somewhere out there, there's a dramatic official copy of this document with a big red wax seal, like the 1685 patent for Rensselaer Manor in the New York State Library. But for Livingston Manor, I haven't really found it yet. So I've been working with various 19th and 18th century copies. Every time the Livingstons got into a fight about where their manor's borders actually were, which was basically every 10 years, they had to draw up new copies of all these documents. So they're all, I've run into them in like every archive in the Hudson Valley. This one over here is in the FDR library. So historians have been looking at these manorial patents since the 19th century, but I think we've really underestimated just how much we can learn from them. Can I turn the page? So first, let's see. I want to look together at what the Livingstons actually received from the crown when they got this patent. And this is like, I used to know exactly where this is here, but you don't really have to follow along. So this is what they got. Not land, but all the messuage, tenements, buildings, fences, orchards, gardens, pastures, meadows, marshes, woods, underwoods, trees, timbers, quarries, rivers, runs, rivulets, brooks, ponds, lakes, streams, creeks, harbors, beaches, fishing, hawking, hunting, fowling, mines, minerals, silver and gold mines only accepted, as well as all the rights, members, liberties, privileges, jurisdictions, royalties, hereditaments, profits, advantages, and appurtenances whatsoever. So at first blush, this might sound like a lot of legalese. In the first draft of the chapter that talks about this, I called it legal language of the ass covering variety, and I was told that that was not formal enough for academic work. How many ways can we say land, right? But actually, in much of 17th century England, the use rights and the privileges associated with all these different things, these different aspects of the land, these places, these, fishing and hawking, right, were widely distributed among community members by a combination of custom and contract. So in New York, the English crown was releasing its rights to all of these things to Robert Livingston. But that didn't really mean that he would get to keep them or want to keep them, right? So Indigenous people also had long established rights and relationships to these landscapes in basically every category I just listed, from buildings to meadows to hunting, right? And as we'll see, this document didn't really get rid of those relationships. And second, when the Livingstons, and I say Livingstons because actually Robert's wife Alida was the manor's primary manager in his life and the early history of the manor, while Robert was focused on their mercantile business, which actually made quite a bit more money. So when the Livingstons leased land, their tenants expected to receive some, right? Some, but not all of these things for their own use. They might have timber rights in some places, but not other places. Fishing and hunting rights in some places, but not other places. And all of this was kind of negotiated. So this patent was granted to Robert Livingston by New York's colonial governor at the time, an Irish Catholic, actually, and career imperialist named Thomas Dongan, who it's worth noting, I think, had actually grown up on his family's manor in Ireland. Historians have rightly argued that Livingston's connections to Dongan, his sort of political relationship with the Dongan administration, was key to getting his manor. And a quick glance back at the patent I showed before for Rensselaer Manor shows us why Thomas Dongan might have looked important to historians, right? However, This legal document, this manor patent, also tells us something important about the Livingstons' indigenous political connections. And they were also really important to Livingston's ability to get this document. So Robert Livingston was New York's Secretary for Indian Affairs, which basically meant he took the notes at all the treaty meetings. Here's a picture of him on one side and the Mohican Edo Okam on the other side. So his position as Indian Secretary helped Livingston build political relationships with colonial officials and native leaders and diplomats. Edo Okam actually traveled to London in 1710 along with 3 Mohawk leaders to meet Queen Anne, right? So this is an important political figure of the kind that Livingston would have met when he was taking notes at these treaty meetings. And in fact, Robert and Elida Livingston depended on their political, diplomatic, and personal relationships with Mohicans to get and develop their manor. And that fact is really written into this document, right, into the manor patent. So legally, you can only get a document like this from the Crown if you first prove to the colonial government that you've already purchased the land from native people. First, you bought land from native people, and then you get the right to the land granted from the Crown. That's how it's supposed to work. So the Livingston's immediate problem was that the Mohicans weren't interested in selling huge quantities of their land. And the Livingstons weren't really in a position to cheat the Mohicans, who were important players in late 17th century Indigenous diplomacy, and also their neighbors. They were, however, perhaps in a position to cheat the colonial government. So to convince the governor to grant this patent, the Livingstons first purchased 2 small plots of land from the Mohicans, just a few hundred acres each. And I should have a map here. Yes. Let's see. One part of the land they purchased was like over here, and the other part was over here in Tacon. So when the Livingstons presented these purchases to the governor of New York, they acted, and this is really clear in the paperwork, as if they were contiguous, right? So I've underlined this line here. Another tract of land called Taconic Line and being adjacent unto the upper cited tract of land along the Hudson River, right? And that same passage is actually underlined in the 18th century copy, I believe by someone who was like, wait a second. To sell the lie, the Livingstons emphasize, right, that they're both on this stream called Roll of Chanson's Kill, which makes them sound really close together. Actually, it's just a very long stream. And actually, it's not even just a very long stream. I recently realized that it's 2 streams that they were pretending was one stream. 2 very long streams that almost but don't quite connect. The Livingstons also erased a place name, a Mahaskakuk, which was a swamp or thicket that marked the eastern boundary of their purchase from the Mohicans. So in the copy of the deed that the Livingstons sent the governor, they conveniently replaced Mahaskakuk with the phrase running back into the woods, which was supposed to be underlined when I clicked that. There we go. So it's a lie and an omission, and it turned about 1,000 acres into about 160,000 acres. But the Livingstons weren't really cheating the Mohicans, who knew exactly what they'd sold. They were cheating the colonial government, which couldn't interpret their own land records, because those land records were defined entirely in terms of Indigenous landmarks and landscapes. So I've underlined a bunch of Indigenous place names, right, in this colonial patent for Livingston Manor. And this is just for one small section. So these terms were really meaningful to the Mohicans. And they probably made some amount of sense to the Livingstons, who knew the area to some degree, I believe. But none of them had any meaning whatsoever to the governor of New York or any other imperial official who lived further away than Albany. At the same time, right, the Mohicans didn't leave this area, nor did the Livingstons expect them to. In fact, I have talked about large groups of native people potentially moving onto the manor in this period. Instead, Robert and Elida Livingston continued to quietly buy Mohican land and pay off claims for generations. So in the 1720s, the family purchased multiple areas of, quote, their manor from the Mohicans. For example, this 1724 agreement, basically a quitclaim for Mohican land on the northern border of the manor, an agreement that Livingston had to make with local Mohicans before he could settle tenant farmers in this area. And in the 1750s, Robert Livingston Jr. renegotiated fishing rights with Akeem, a native man who had the right to fish at a place called Cook Peak, where the family had just built a dam to supply water to their new ironworks, which is a part of this story that I don't have time to get into. The Livingstons gave Akeem a key that let him raise the gate to the dam for 12 days and nights in the spring so that he could fish, and recorded this agreement in their rent book, which is concrete evidence that Native people on Livingston Manor, right, were exercising these different kinds of land rights well into the 18th century, 70 years after that patent was granted. Although there are few surviving records about the Mohicans who lived on Livingston Manor, we do know that there was a Mohican community living on the manor until at least 1793. Furthermore, because all of these colonial patents were articulated in terms of indigenous landmarks, families like the Livingstons and Van Rensselaers depended on Mohicans to tell them where their property started and ended. So, for example, in 1712, Robert Livingston and Henry Van Rensselaer got into a conflict over the location of their border, which had been set according to an indigenous landmark called Mawanaquazik. And on this map, it's very clearly noted right here, although the actual historicalness of this map is highly questionable. So this Mawanaquazik was a place with spiritual significance to the Mohicans, according to the surviving records. It also probably marked an important indigenous political border that ran north to south, but it became the marker of a colonial border running east to west. So this indigenous landmark was utilized in multiple English legal documents. Controversy over its location could really only be settled by local Mohicans, who in fact were brought to the area or came to the area and knew exactly where this spot was supposed to be, much to Livingston's pleasure and Van Rensselaer's dismay, as it turned out. So basically, every time into the 1760s that the Livingstons surveyed land on their manor in any kind of large way, beyond individual farm lots, they needed local Mohicans there to interpret this deed that they had gotten in the 1680s that was defined in terms of Mohican landscapes. So this is like a concrete way, right, in which the manor as an institution is facilitating this layering I was talking about of indigenous and colonial landscapes. And this layering really goes hand in hand with the layering of indigenous and colonial sovereignty, right? So the indigenous communities living on manors, living in the Hudson Valley in general, govern themselves. They don't come under the authority of New York internally throughout the colonial period. So far, I've made relationships between indigenous people and settlers sound rather cooperative. The truth is, as settler populations grew in the 18th century, agreements between settlers and indigenous communities became increasingly coercive and unequal, right? At the same time, for the Wappingers, a Munsee-speaking people whose homeland bordered the Mohicans to the south, so here, basically. Let's see, I lost my spot. For the Wappingers, cooperation with colonists was underwritten by a willingness to resist colonial encroachment more aggressively. So in large parts of the central Hudson Valley, large estates like the Livingstons, Van Rensselaers, Phillipses, and Beekmans remained Indian country into the 1720s and 30s. But at the end of the 1720s, the pace of settlement begins to pick up really, really quickly as colonial landowners are moving to survey and lease or sell land. And so the Wappingers in this period are facing colonial incursions from multiple directions, from people who own or think they own or claim to own or want to own these four large patents that overlap their land: the Phillips patent, the Rombaught patent, the Beekman patent, and the Great Nine Partners patent. So, for example, in the 1720s, when local landowner Katharina Brett wants to survey and lease out land she had inherited near the fish kills, the Wappinger, quote, violently obstructed the surveyor, threatened her with bodily harm, and ultimately forced Brett to both pay them 70 pounds and allow them to continue living on what she was trying to claim was her land. And this is the house, which still stands and is a museum today. And in 1727, Henry Beekman purchased land in eastern Dutchess County from the Wappingers. Beekman believed his father had already purchased this land in the 1690s when the family received their land patent from the government. But in fact, the Beekmans, like the Livingstons, had purchased a much, much smaller area of land. In 1735, 8 years later, the Wappingers were still obstructing Henry Beekman's efforts to lease this land. Beekman wrote in one sort of very angry sounding letter that I don't know if it was actually sent: "What use is it to buy land of the Indians? For if we buy it, they will still claim forever." Still, he didn't actually start issuing leases to settlers on Wappinger land until 1737. So he might have come to think of this land as his. He might have believed that his father had purchased it in the 1690s. But in order to actually write leases and develop it as a manor, as a place where tenant farmers could live and farm, he needed to negotiate that process with the Wappingers. So on Hudson Valley manors like Livingston Manor or the Beekman Estate, land purchases weren't only about alienating Mohican and Wappinger land. They were also a series of agreements, albeit, I do want to stress, made under increasingly unequal and coerced circumstances that govern native and settler coexistence. Who could use which areas of the manor when and in what ways? Where would native people plant, hunt, and fish, and where would colonists plant, hunt, and fish? In the Hudson Valley in the first half of the 18th century, purchasing native land could imply coexisting with rather than replacing native people. And the land records we've looked at, right, and many other land records provide powerful evidence of the ways in which indigenous and colonial landscapes could be overlaid. I'm going to take a breath and have a drink of water because when I resume, we will be in like the last section of the talk, although I have absolutely no idea what time it is. In the 1750s and 60s, this entire manorial world that I've been describing this afternoon, a world where colonists and indigenous people lived side by side, where rights to land, and not just rights to land, but the landscape itself, how it was understood and described, were negotiated between indigenous communities, manor lords, and tenant farmers, was being challenged. It was being challenged by massive demographic growth in several communities. So here is a chart of basically the growth in the number of leases on Livingston Manor and the Beekman patents between 1730 and 1745. The yellow line is population growth in Dutchess County as a whole, kind of brought down to that level for comparison purpose, right? And these trends continue into the future. I did not continue my chart because it took a lot of work to add a line to this thing. This world was also being challenged by the landlords, as I hinted at the beginning of this presentation. So the 1750s and 60s were a moment of Anglicization and imperial reform across the British Empire, right? So in Britain, this is the moment when capitalism is rapidly expanding its reach through the expansion of commercial agriculture, the large-scale enclosure of manorial property in England, and of course, a little thing called the Industrial Revolution that might have had important effects. Across the British Empire, a spirit of what elite landowners and politicians called improvement was taking root. In the Hudson Valley, both indigenous people and tenant farmers contested these changes. They tried to defend the world they built together. So for the last 15 minutes of my talk, I'd like to dive into a particular story from this moment to look at a dramatic example of tenants and indigenous people contesting landlords' efforts to make their manors more commercial, more capitalistic, to replace long leases with short leases, to replace traditional customary rents paid in wheat with rent paid in money. So in the mid-1760s, a major tenant revolt rocks the Hudson Valley. This movement was led by tenants on the northern part of the Phillipses estate in southern Dutchess County, land that the Wappingers claimed never to have sold. And so the Phillips patent is here. Here, it was southern Dutchess County at the time. I think it's all of Putnam County now. I could have that confused. So let's see. So between 1764 and 1766, tenant farmers and squatters on the Phillipses' land launched a series of armed standoffs, mob actions, a coordinated rent strike that was very well organized, and jailbreaks in protest against their improving landlords. And at the same time, the summer of 1766, Daniel Nimham, the newly minted leader of the Wappingers, travels to London to petition the British Board of Trade, the government body responsible for British imperial policy everywhere in the world, actually, where the British Empire has a presence, to reaffirm the Wappingers' rights to their land on the Phillipses' estate. Nimham was accompanied by a group of Mohican diplomats who had their own petition in support of colonial squatters from New England living on Rensselaer Manor. The The Wappingers allied themselves with rebellious tenants. They offered settlers on the Phillips's patent 999-year leases with only nominal rent, such as one peppercorn. These Wappinger leases didn't have any economic meaning, obviously, but they were a powerful symbolic statement of the Wappingers' continuing presence and sovereignty. And they were akin to the small, very small, symbolic payments that colonial landowners and manor lords paid to the British crown, called quit rents, right? So the Livingston family paid a very, very tiny amount of money to the crown every year for the rights to all of this land, right? It wasn't really about economics, although the British government did sort of hope that it would add up to a lot if everyone paid them, which they mostly didn't. But it had a major meaning about the relationships of power and authority in the region. In return for the Wappingers' support, tenant leaders financed the Wappingers and Mohicans' trip to London. So generations of historians have written about this Renters' Rebellion in 1766. But despite taking very different approaches, I think that all of them have actually, in a sense, gotten this moment completely backwards. They've taken anti-landlord rhetoric at face value, and they've argued that tenants were fighting against the existing manorial system. In fact, I believe that many tenants were fighting to preserve the existing manorial system. At the same time, historians have mostly presented the Wappingers as bit players in this sort of tenant rebellion, who were manipulated by settlers in the traditional account, and weren't really treated ever as autonomous actors with their own goals. I argue that they had obviously their own objectives here, and that those objectives aligned with tenants in really key ways, which is why the collaboration made sense to both sides. So a clearer and more accurate understanding of both tenants and Indigenous communities' motivations clarifies the larger stakes of this moment. So Hudson Valley tenant leaders developed a succinct analysis of class injustice. When tenant leader William Prendergast was asked why tenants didn't turn to the courts to defend their rights, he reportedly answered, quote, "There was no law for poor men," end quote, and quote, "Poor men were always oppressed by the rich." However, audacious claims like these, although they illuminate tenants' worldviews and tactics, have disguised the fact that tenants' demands weren't actually very radical. Although there were certainly quite a few men among them who hoped to be rid of their landlords altogether and who hoped that their Wappinger leases would become the basis for a more secure tenure without landlords. Again and again, rebellious tenants insisted that what they wanted was to, quote, "come to terms with their landlords." And tenant leaders clarified exactly what terms they were demanding. In the words of one organizer, leases for 3 lives on the rents which had been formerly fixed. And this is why I spent so long at the beginning of the talk explaining how leases for lives worked, right? Manorial society in the 18th century had been really defined by these customary lease terms. Lives, not years, rent set by custom rather than according to the market. As I mentioned before, most farmers paid between 15 and 20 Dutch shekels of wheat per year for fat hens and 1 or 2 days of work. I want to stress that these rents were not nominal, right? In fact, 15 to 20 Dutch shekels of wheat might have approached like a third or more of a farmer's surplus production for the market. So it was a major economic burden. Although it didn't really add up to very much money for landlords, actually, because this was such a dramatically unequal society. But these customary rents were very predictable, right? And tenants held a majority stake, as I've explained, in the houses, farms, fences, and fields that they'd built and cleared mostly with their own hands. So in the 1760s, landlord and Philip Sir Beverly Robinson, shown here alongside the fancy new house he built in the Hudson Valley at this time, alongside his brothers-in-law, Philip Phillips and Roger Morris, threw these traditional lease terms out the window on the Phillips Highland patent. Instead of leases for 3 lives, Robinson offered 1-year at-will leases. Instead of charging rent in wheat, he charged rent in money, which exposed farmers to the fluctuating value of wheat on Atlantic markets. These changes vastly increased the uncertainty that farmers faced, while increasing and regularizing landlords' incomes. Furthermore, between 1761 and 1764, when Robinson, Phillips, and Morris filed suits of eviction against tenants and squatters who'd taken leases from the Wappingers, they demanded that they, quote, "purchase their farms paying money down or remove immediately without compensation." So in fact, this would have meant stealing the tenant's stake in the farm, the 2/3 of the farm that under the traditional system, the tenant was understood to own. What had belonged to tenants was suddenly supposed to belong to the landlords. It was supposed to be the landlord's land, right? So Beverly Robinson and Philip Phillips were trying to remake a manorial economy that their families had spent the last 7 decades kind of co-creating. That economy had been defined by long leases, traditional rents, relative settler autonomy, and also coexistence with Native people, and with them, the survival of alternate ways of understanding and living on the land. In its place, these landlords, as I've explained, envisioned a much more capitalistic kind of agriculture defined by short leases, money rent, and a carefully surveyed and bounded landscape. It was this model of agricultural development that turned the Phillips's land claims, which were based on this patent that they'd gotten in the 1690s, right? They'd had it for a long time, into an immediate threat to Wappinger land and sovereignty. And in this context, Wappinger and Mohican diplomats in London, like rebellious tenants, were participating, I believe, in a larger debate over what it meant to own property in the Hudson Valley, and ultimately over the terms on which Atlantic markets were going to shape colonial development. So in late July 1766, the Wappinger Sachem Daniel Nimham arrived in England, accompanied by 3 Mohican diplomats and 3 Indigenous women. Over the following months, the Indian chiefs, as they're described usually in the newspapers, visited attractions like Stonehenge and the Tower of London. They met with important figures at every level of London society, including some of the city's most prominent political figures. They became both spectators and attractions at a London pleasure garden, and they had their every move eagerly reported on by the London press. And so here's a view of London at the time, and some of these newspaper reports, right? Here's the Indian chief and their ladies at the Marylebone Gardens as guests of honor at a musical entertainment. Here is a detailed description of their arrival. So everywhere they went, the Mohicans and Wappingers carefully presented themselves as both sophisticated, fashionable Britons and, quote, savage Indians, right? And they played off Londoners' expectations. They bought new wardrobes in London at the crown's expense, including 28 shirts, 5 black silk neckcloths, breeches, a fine hat with a gold band and buckle, 10 pairs of shoes, fine silk, and of course 3 large black leather trunks from Brian's Trunk Warehouse in Charing Cross to keep it all in. And the receipts they submitted to the government for reimbursement are all in the British National Archives to this day. Often the Indigenous women dressed, at least according to the newspaper, as ladies, probably meaning English ladies, right? While the men were a combination of Indigenous American and English fashions, for example, touring the armory at St. James in traditional dress paired with the gold-laced hat that I mentioned a moment ago. When they were called to make their case before the Board of Trade, the Wappingers and Mohicans presented complementary but very different petitions. Petitions that made clever use of settler violence back home in the Hudson Valley in support of their own aims. The Wappingers, who lived on the land contested by tenant activists and their rent rebellion, claimed that that land had been stolen. Frederick Phillips's 1697 colonial land patent was illegitimate because he'd never purchased native title, technically true. This should not surprise us, of course, as we've seen 17th century landowners often acquired government patents before they purchased the land from the native proprietors. In the 1730s and 40s, the Wappingers had successfully defended their claims through force and persuasion in the Hudson Valley. By the 1760s, this strategy was no longer working, and so they tried to achieve redress through imperial courts. And they presented themselves both in the petitions and in how they dressed and how they acted in London as both British and native, at once foreign diplomats and petitioning subjects, right? The Mohicans presented a very different argument to the crown. The Mohicans' petition was on behalf of Massachusetts settlers living on the New York side of the Massachusetts border on land the Van Rensselaer family claimed as part of their manor. And you can see, so the part of Rensselaer Manor that this was dealing with is down here. And you can see that this map maker in the mid-1770s put a thick black border on this part of Livingston Manor and no thick black border on this part of Livingston Manor. And I don't think that's a coincidence, right? He knew that where exactly this line was a heavily contested fact in this moment. So just like in southern Dutchess County, this area had been rocked by violence. But unlike on the Phillips estate, where tenants had led the charge, the violence on Rensselaer Manor seems to have been provoked by the Van Rensselaers themselves as a pretext for evictions. The Mohican petition was a protest against the Van Rensselaers' violence. They didn't actually ask for anything. Their petition concludes, "We should be glad of your excellency's order, how we ought to behave in these circumstances, whether we may engage in the quarrel or not." So the petitions of the Wappingers and Mohicans complement each other really artfully. The Wappingers' land had been stolen. They pursued justice through the colonial legal system and not received it, and now they turned to the king to affirm their rights. The Mohicans, who probably believed the Wappinger victory would set a valuable precedent for them, didn't really ask for anything. Instead, they complained on behalf of settlers on Rensselaer Manor, whom they presented as English, against New York landlords, who they cleverly presented as Dutch. The Wappingers had a strong land claim, but the violence in their homeland had been driven by tenants. Whatever the merits of their cause, right? Kidnapping justices, breaking jails, refusing to pay your rent, and especially beating up government officials were all really illegal in the 18th century. So the Mohicans, on the other hand, didn't have a land claim in quite the same way. But the unrest in their homeland had been much more clearly provoked by landlords. So by marrying the land claim of the Wappingers to the unrest on Mohican land, the two petitions presented a very unflattering view of New York's government and put both nation struggles in the best possible light. This strategy worked really well in London. Shelburne, right, is the Secretary of State in charge of the American colonies in this period. And the Mohicans really seem to win him over. And this is Whitehall, which is where the diplomats went to make this case, right? Although I actually think the Board of Trade met above the Treasury building, which is like right there, not on the painting. Shelburne and the Board of Trade prepared a very sympathetic report to the king. And in fact, I've come to believe that Daniel Nimham and the Mohicans' arguments seem to have had an impact on British policy in this moment. They helped persuade Shelburne that tighter regulation of land sales might satisfy both Indigenous and settler communities on the empire's frontiers, which wasn't really true, probably. Unfortunately, however, there wasn't much that even the king himself could do for the Wappingers. Despite a very strongly worded letter from the Earl of Shelburne to the governor of New York, the Wappingers didn't win their land case. The governor put on a big show of rehearing the case, but ruled against them for a second time. Likewise, the Tenant rebellion on New York's manors was utterly crushed by British troops deployed by the governor that summer. And on the heels of Tenant's defeat, Beverly Robinson raised the average rent on his part of the Phillips estate by 82% between 1766 and 1777. So in other words, kind of failure all around. But these failures shouldn't obscure the extraordinary nature of the effort. Fundamentally, both the Wappingers and tenant activists were contesting the terms of economic development in the Hudson Valley and in the British Empire. They were contesting the terms of colonial governments, and they were contesting the very meaning of property. For the Wappingers, writing leases for settlers was itself a meaningful statement of Indigenous sovereignty, and defending their land claims was an attempt to defend a long history of coexistence between Indigenous people and settlers in the Hudson Valley. Tenants, on the other hand, were fighting to preserve a vision of manorial agriculture in which property rights were distributed between landlords and farmers, neither of whom had an absolute right to the land. Together, their actions represent a dramatic moment of interracial, intercultural resistance to the political and economic changes of the 1760s, to the intensification of colonial government and the turn towards capitalist agriculture that was happening across the British Empire at this moment, and would piss off a lot of colonists in a lot of ways that you can probably imagine. But we can only see this significance, right? We can only really understand this moment, its potential, its resonance, and not least its relationship to other popular movements that opposed rural capitalism in the 1760s. Anti-enclosure movements in Ireland, the regulator rebellions in North Carolina, right? There are other rural movements in this period kind of contesting the terms of property and contesting these changes. And we can see these changes when we recognize that colonial property in the Hudson Valley was relational, it was negotiated, and it was contested. That manorial land ownership accommodated overlapping claims to land and facilitated a kind of layering of Indigenous and colonial landscapes and sovereignties. And that this created a potential for collaboration as well as for conflict. We have to recognize, to make sense of this moment, that Indigenous and colonial understandings of and relationships to the land were fundamentally interwoven in the Hudson Valley. And that is the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So I want to hold you up here for a bit. You can get your water. But I would like to get questions from the crowd. I'll also be monitoring questions on Zoom in case anybody has questions there. Yeah, I'll take questions. I'll repeat them to the mic so that people can hear on Zoom. Yes, in the back.
Hello, thank you so much for this talk. It's such an interesting period of history and perspective that we don't usually get, I think. And is your manuscript going to be a book? Is that the idea?
Yeah, it's gonna be a book.
Here,
Cool.
so the question was, will the manuscript be a book?
Yes, eventually.
My question is, I'm wondering about when the tide started to turn. You brought us there through the lens of capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, and that's clear. But I'm also thinking about the population growing and the migration of people up into the Hudson Valley, and were those two things like feeding each other? Was it a coincidence, or was it like, oh, there are more people, therefore this is a great moment to change these customs? So I'm wondering, like, I think in general, I always think about what led to the mass displacement of Indigenous people, like, because for a while there's this, like, to a degree, coexistence going on. So I always think about, like, was it the population and migration of settlers more than other forces? Like, how much was that a huge force in this big term?
Yeah.
So
Oh,
the
yeah, you have to
question,
repeat it.
in brief, in addition
It's
to
online.
the growth of capitalism and industrialization, when thinking about the displacement of Indigenous peoples, what does the role in terms of the population growth play in this phenomenon? In brief, I guess.
This is a fantastic question. Yeah, population growth is really important. Part of what's happening in the Hudson Valley particularly is actually that this sort of leasehold manorial system is slowing down population growth. So in New England, for example, the population grows much more quickly. In New Jersey, the population grows much more quickly. Whether or not manorialism causes this is like heavily contested by historians, but I personally think it does. It really slows down settlement. Basically because landlords see themselves as they have a variety of incentives that are kind of slowing down, to kind of slow down the process. I think that the relationship between this sort of intensification of capitalist agriculture and these discourses of improvement and population growth is not like a coincidence, but not straightforwardly causal either. It's definitely true that people are pushing to get onto this land. And so that's how you get, right, these big squatter communities that are fueling some of these conflicts. And so landlords no longer maybe feel like they can afford to wait, but at the same time, they have these new ways of thinking about what it's going to look like to settle in a state. I also do think that I'm always very hesitant to see demographic growth among colonists as like a fait accompli for displacing Indigenous people. I don't think that one of those things inevitably leads to the other of those things. There's always a more complicated kind of mechanism going on, if that makes sense.
Other questions? Yes.
Taking your analysis further, let's assume for the next 30 or 40 years, with the beginning of treaty making on the part of the state, for instance, New York State, and later the federal government, really condemn the Indians to the loss of their land by legalistic means.
So the question here is thinking about the role of New York State about 30 years later and treaty making and loss of land, and BJ can speak to that.
So the American Revolution changes everything. It really does. It changes property, what property means. It doesn't get rid of the manorial system, right? The manorial system is not, survives into the 1840s and is a huge part of the state's history until the anti-rent movement finally has to write a new state constitution basically to ban feudal land tenure, right, in the 1840s. But the meaning of land ownership and the meaning of property and the political organization of the colony turned state are just so fundamentally transformed by the American Revolution. What interests me most as a historian is trying to understand the colonial period on its own terms, not as like a prelude to the United States, but as its own thing with its own logic that we can try and understand. And that understanding it on its own terms and with its own logic allows us to kind of see why things are happening the way they're happening in the colonial period. In a way that if we think too much about the 19th century, we kind of lose sight of. Because it becomes the prehistory of the United States, right? And part of what this means is that I don't know the answer to your question because I try not to study too much about the 19th century.
Fair question. Yes.
So first of all, thank you very much. It's a great job. The manors that you mentioned are Robinson, Phillips, they end up being Tories. The Livingstons and Schuyler's turn out to be patriots. Did they differ in their practices, or were they all kind of part of this more capitalist approach to land changes?
So the question is, when it hits the Revolutionary War, some of the manors are Tories, loyalists, and some of them are patriots. And is there any difference in how the manorial systems work?
Yeah. Good job. So it's a very good question. The changes I'm tracing here, although they absolutely trigger these tenant revolts, in my opinion, or in my read of this history, they're very uneven, right? So there are still a huge number of places in the Hudson Valley where things are kind of going on in the old way. There are so many things that impact how a manor is run, right? How close you are to New York City is a major factor because it changes what the markets you're dealing with look like, right? So Van Cortlandt Manor, Phillips Manor are mostly moving to a cash economy much earlier, but it's not really to exploit tenants. It's because the tenants aren't growing wheat because they can make more money like making cheese for New York City and stuff like that, right? And so it gets really complicated. I have not seen a pattern between Tory and Patriot necessarily. Although, yeah, the intersection of these things is just a very involved thing in New York, and I don't really, I guess, know the answer to your question, and not in the sense of like I don't know it, but like I don't know if it's even something. It would take a lot of research into that specific question, I think, to get the answer to that, because there are so many factors affecting why someone sides with the empire or not, the sort of different kinds of patriots and Tories, how gung-ho you are about it, and that affects the choices you make, the choices tenants are making, and how that feeds back into the choices landlords are making, all of these kind of different factors. But it's a great question.
Thank you. Yes.
During this time, what's happening in the relationship between the native population and the white population? Is there much intermarriage? Are they still parallel tracks, or they get muddled together? And what happened to just the total population of the natives over this, say, 1680 to 1760 period?
So the question is about the social dimension between the settler colonialists and the indigenous population, and is there any intermarriage do we see here, and what does that population change look like?
This is also a fantastic question. I'll take the second part first. I don't know what the population dynamics of the indigenous population look like. It's not something that the colonial government really keeps track of. And I think it's very risky to make assumptions about it. I seem to keep sort of finding indigenous communities like in places, that people aren't really talking about, right? And so the idea that I think there's a general sense in the literature on colonial New York that indigenous populations are shrinking as people move west. And this is definitely happening, right? So as in one sense, or people are moving west, put it that way. So as the Wappingers are kind of taking up this land case. A pretty substantial group of them take a totally different tack and they move out into the Ohio country, right? And they're just sort of go their own way. And the nation splits geographically, but again, I don't think we can really make assumptions about what this means for how they think of themselves or how they think about their relationships to each other. On the other hand, in the 1670s and 80s, Indigenous people were moving into the Hudson Valley, right? So a lot of Indigenous communities from New England come into the Hudson Valley after King Philip's War. So there's demographic movement going on, and we don't really understand it very well. What is absolutely true is that the settler population grows so quickly that whatever happens to the Indigenous population, its share of the overall population gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller in a very dramatic way over the course of the period. In terms of the other part of your question, there is a lot of interaction. Again, it's not super well documented. Indigenous people are moving through settler communities. They're working for settlers on a wage labor basis. They also very early, already in the 1740s and 50s for sure, they're making sort of handcrafts like baskets and brooms and selling them in settler communities to support themselves. There's conversion to Christianity in some Indigenous communities and not in others. And this is really complicated and something I could talk more about, but I would maybe leave the time for other questions. But that's also a complicated, contested relationship because, of course, Christianity is not a straightforward thing, right? Like, if you decide to become a Moravian Christian under the influence of German missionaries, like, what is your relationship now? How has it changed vis-a-vis Congregationalists or Dutch Reformed, right? Like, it's not like Christianity is just a straightforward thing either. So yeah, a lot of cultural mixing, cultural changes happening on both sides. But what exactly it looks like is sort of difficult to fully understand, I think.
Thank you. I can take maybe one more question. And then I think BJ will be around for a bit to chat afterwards, and we have refreshments in the other room.
Yeah.
Any other questions in this room? Yes.
Yes, but what about the end of the French and Indian War in 1763, forms that has on how there's no more, fear of the French and Indians coming out. So now you can build and things without that fear.
So the question is about the impact of the French and Indian War on the location, or, yeah.
Huge impact, absolutely. So the Mohicans, and this is another piece of the story that it's like, I don't know, I feel like this talk was already too long, but there's so much that gets left out, right? But the Mohicans and Wappingers who go to London had served in the French and Indian War on the side of the British. And they, they sort of used this as part of this sort of larger diplomatic strategy of presenting themselves as like good British subjects and also Indigenous diplomats, right? Like at the same time. The end of the 7 Years' War totally changes the balance of power in North America. It forever changes how Indigenous people in the largest sense are going to relate to colonists. It makes the American Revolution possible in so many ways, or sets the stage for it. In terms of the Mohicans and the Wappingers and the tenants living on Beverly Robinson's estate, right? Yeah, they're inside of these larger changes in the same way that like what's happening to small communities in the United States in the 50s and 60s and 70s doesn't have nothing to do with the Vietnam War, right? Like it's all you live in your times and it's affecting you, but tracing the exact contours of that change or making a really clear argument about that change, in this case, is something that I don't really do because I think the impact is kind of secondary or delayed or complicated in some way, if that makes any sense. I don't know if that made any sense.
Great. I had one question online asking about the boundary line between the Livingston estate and a Rensselaer estate that was marked by a rock on Manor Road. Not sure if you're very familiar with very local history, but have you come across this rock?
No.
Yeah, that's okay. Sorry, I don't have an answer for that, but it could be out there. So thank you again, BJ, for a wonderful talk, and thank you all for being a wonderful audience. Please take some cookies in the other room, and enjoy the rest of your day.